listen later.
Are you going to post it on your Facebook page? Or?
Yeah, and we'll post the link on Facebook and we'll post it on our website. We have a section of the Chester County website that has all the past stuff from tournament director meetings.
Okay, good.
Yep.
Good.
All right, well, welcome everybody and folks who come later. This is, I think, the third annual tournament director. I'm Steve Weimar, and next to me is Stan Horn. We're at Chester County Bassmaster, and I'm on the Black Bass Advisory Subcommittee that Joe and the Maryland DNR organized. Joe, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, and I'm Joe Love, the Tidal Bass Program Manager. Co-hosting this with Steve. So thank you guys for joining up tonight. I appreciate it. I think
any others on the call want to identify themselves? Nate, Jonathan, Den, is it? Den? I don't know. Den. Hey, Nate.
Yeah, I'm Dennis Wojciechowski, Tournament Director for ABA Division 9. I think I saw you guys down there last Saturday.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. I'm Jonathan Stewart. I'm the Tournament Director for Berks Bassmasters.
Great to have you with us.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi, I'm Nate Taylor. I'm in Tux Club, Blue Hem Bass Anglers. I'm the treasurer, and I if anybody could just sit in and listen. So,
yeah, awesome, cool.
Thank you.
Thanks, Nate.
All right, so Joe will share some information on the sort of state of the fishery, and then we can talk a little bit about what's the Black Bass Sub-Advisory Committee's been doing, representing the community that uses the fisheries. And then any questions you guys have, we'll be happy to entertain them. Talk.
Yeah.
I know someone just joined a 302 number. Did you want to introduce yourself? Gone.
It's very quick.
All right, I won't ask anyone to introduce themselves if they're just on the phone. Okay, go ahead, Joe.
All right. Well, I'm going to try and keep this, brief. I wanted to, first of all, thank you guys again. And we will, some of this information I gave to our subcommittee already, but, there's some new information here for, specifically tournament directors and kind of the goal, I think, of what I'd like to do here is you talk a little bit about the status of the fisheries, show you guys how the information you provide every year is being used, and then talk about some other very brief initiatives that you guys might have an interest in, and then, kind of open it up. Steve's going to talk a little bit about the subcommittee and some of the progress they're making. But I also want this to kind of be a forum of information exchange. So if you guys have problems or concerns that you want to voice, even while I'm, going through some of these slides, feel free to voice your concerns or your thoughts, and we'll work through them. So we did have this past year over 200 tournaments, which is great. But we did have a lot of cancellations. BASS's Elite Series canceled. Largely, these cancellations are because of the weather. We had a lot of precipitation, a lot of rain, a lot of logs in the water, which is why the Elite canceled. But we did have about 200, and that's pretty good statewide. I think we probably don't have anything surprising to show you. The biggest bags of bass across the state came from the Upper Bay. That's probably not a surprise to most of you. The highest catch rates came from Lake Habib, the Potomac River, and Deep Creek Lake. And what we thought was really exciting, this is one of those fast facts on the tournament director sheet that we sent you guys, is that this past year we had the highest level of survival at scales that we've measured since we've been measuring it. So that's really good news.
Joe,
yeah.
counting the number of tournaments, that's based on submitted reports?
What's that, sir?
This is Steve. How many, you said there were 200 tournaments. How are you counting those?
Well, we're counting those through the reports.
The reports.
Submitted. Yeah, we had about 450 tournaments permitted. We had a lot of cancellations, though. And then there are some that didn't report, but most directors did report their tournaments. And, of course, we have probably more than 200 because there are a lot of tournaments that aren't required, a lot of directors who are not required to report, particularly those who have, under 10 votes. So for those that are required to report and did report, we learned that probably, again, nothing surprising, but the three biggest areas for tournament activity were Cecil County, Charles County, and Garrett County out there at Deep Creek Lake here. But by far in the state, the biggest players are in Cecil County or in the Upper Bay area, and Charles County and on the Potomac River. So I wanted to, talk about the status of those fisheries. There's some information on the other fisheries as well. But before I got into that, I kind of just wanted to give a really quick overview of how the data you guys supply are used in management and how we manage the fishery. And so for really any population of species, including our own, one of the main things we look at is abundance. How many fish in the sea, how many humans there are on the planet. And in this case, we're looking at how many, largemouth bass there are. And, some years or some periods, abundance is going to increase, and sometimes abundance is going to decrease. And the two things that influence population or abundance increase are birth rates and immigration. And for declining abundance, it's deaths and emigration, or the fish actually leaving the system. Now for bass, for largemouth bass, they tend to be home bodies. You guys know that. So the two biggest players here are birth rates and death rates. So those are the two major things. It's not that immigration and emigration, or fish coming in and leaving on their own, isn't important, but bass tend to be home bodies. So we really pay attention to birth rates and death rates. And there are a lot of things that can influence, birth rates and death rates for bass. These are some of the principal things that kind of bear out in published studies across the country and in some cases across the world, and specifically in the Chesapeake Bay as well. So for birth rates, water temperature and the size of the fish really are important factors influencing how many fish are reproduced. Water temperature in terms of spawning season that starts around 40 to 60 degrees is about when fish begin getting on their beds. And the larger of the fish tend to have the most juveniles that they reproduce, the most eggs they reproduce. But even the larger fathers out there tend to be better fathers for bass. So the bigger males tend to be better at guarding their nest. And yes, underwater vegetation is important, particularly in the Upper Bay and the Potomac. In some other places where there's not as much underwater vegetation, other underwater structure is important as well, like logs or brush piles. So main takeaway is that habitat plays a very strong role in the birth rate and growing a population, a very, very strong role. And when a population declines, it can also be related to habitat. Habitat plays a very important part in terms of where disease is or what predators are out there. Of course, fish die with age, and that's just a part of biology. But anglers and fishing mortality also plays a role in this part of the equation. because some people are eating fish and sometimes there's catch and release mortality. So we do, pay attention to that as well. The department actually, we actually indirectly or directly measure components of all of these things. So I highlighted all the things we tend to measure indirectly or directly, birthing, reproduction. We pay attention to habitat. We pay attention to death rates. And we do pay attention to other factors like disease. And the reason is because these things influence basically how many fish are in the sea, how many bass are out there. So for the purposes of tonight, we really look at, we're going to be looking at the data you guys supply, catch per angler hour, as a measure of abundance. And we also go out with our boat electrofishing surveys and measure abundance, among other things. And so we'll be using that information to kind of monitor trends in abundance. But we also, one of the other things we get from you guys is mortality at the scale. And that's important because that's a component of fishing mortality here, which again plays a role in maintaining the number of fish in the sea.
So Joe, this is Steve again, back on that slide. So what's not easy to tell from that slide is what the relative contribution is of those factors, right? So angling is not as important magnitude a factor as water quality and the vegetation.
So for this fishery, which is mainly a catch and release, yet I kind of try to illustrate that with just the thickness of the arrows here. Where disease and old age and predators have a thicker arrow, so relatively more important. It is a catch and release fishery. So they're, mainly a lot of the fish are going back alive after they're being caught. So fishing mortality isn't as important in this fishery as, say, habitat is for, basically causing deaths of fish. Like, it's hard to put numbers to this sometimes because, disease, old age, angling pressure, those things vary over time, so their relative influence can change over time. But in general, these habitat-related factors have a larger relative role to play with declining levels of abundance. It's just hard sometimes to put an absolute number on that because it can change from time to time, year to year. So we look at catch rates from tournaments, and we've been doing that on the Potomac River here since the 80s. And these are just average catches. The dark dots represent average catch rates by tournament anglers for the 12-inch season. And the empty dots represent that for the 15-inch season. And back in the 80s and 90s, catch rates on the Potomac River were lower than they are over the past couple of decades. Over the past couple of decades, particularly in the later part of the 2000s, see pretty high catch rates here and for both the 12-inch season and the 15-inch season. There was a drop, a lull, which we've talked about in the past. I believe it's probably related to a couple of things. One, fewer fish in the sea, and then secondly, a loss in recruitment or reproduction owed to habitat. But the good news here is that the fishery, which was struggling for a little while, is rebounding on the Potomac River. And this past year, the catch rates were really good for the 12-inch season and the 15-inch season on the Potomac River. And we have talked to people. I've talked to anglers out there who've been fishing the Potomac over the past 2 years, and they say the fishery has been fishing as good as it ever has. So this is, I think, pretty decent and good news. For the
Joe, you might want to say something about what the horizontal lines are.
Okay, yeah. So these lines illustrate reference points, and basically they're long-term averages. And for the 12-inch season, what we like to see as managers are values that are greater than those long-term averages. And for the 12-inch season, that reference line is this solid line. And for the 15-inch season, the reference line is this dashed line. So they're really just long-term averages. And our hope is that the averages tend to be greater than, or at least at the level of what that long-term average is.
And you, as a department, you have a fisheries management plan that you have to submit to the legislature for approval?
Well, the fishery management plan doesn't have to go to the legislature or the General Assembly for approval. It's already been approved by the secretary of the department. It was approved by Mark Belton. So,
but anyway, the point is that you have to operate in accordance with that plan.
Yes.
And so these reference lines are baked into that. So if the population goes below that, you have to take action as a department.
Correct. You know, we have about 13 indices that we follow. This is one of them. And, we have reference points for those other indices as well. And when we're not meeting standards, basically we're not meeting those reference points, the department begins taking action. And one of those actions, the initial actions, is talking about that with the Black Bass Advisory Subcommittee and talking in-house about how we might, go about, fixing the problem, whatever it is. We did have a problem, and we worked toward fixing it. And I think, in general, I'll get to that a little later, I think we're in much better shape now than we were, about 5 years ago.
Although we don't have any specific evidence that it was our actions, right, that made that. That could just be cyclical. It could be having to do with weather and pollution and other things, right?
Well, we can talk about that.
Mm-hmm.
The weather over the past couple of years has been pretty tough. We've had a lot of floods come down. The grasses last year apparently are in some places not as good as other places. It's harder to tie things to pollution sometimes, but the reality is I think that there was a combination of actions related to angler efforts as well as habitat that helped benefit the fishery. I don't have the data here, but I can send it to you guys. The levels of mortality, angler or fishing mortality, are lower, the levels than they had been, and we have better levels of reproduction than we have, and reproduction is tied in part to habitat. So I think, or in large part to habitat. So I think really a combination of both actions taken on behalf of anglers and habitat have kind of helped to improve the fishery. So in the Upper Bay, we've kind of seen a similar thing with increased catch rates in 2018. The averages for the 12-inch season were greater than the reference and long-term averages, and in fact greater than what we've seen in past years. And that is true for the average for the 15-inch season as well. So the Upper Bay seems to be fishing a little bit better than it had been recently. So that's good news as well. The Deep Creek Lake I have less experience in. I'm more of a tidal bass guy, but I did want to provide the data that we had for Deep Creek Lake because it is one of the big three. And these are the average catch rates for Deep Creek Lake. There aren't as many tournaments out of Deep Creek as there are in the Upper Bay and the Potomac. But that said, the catch rates for the tournaments that we do have out there tend to be pretty consistent from year to year. And in fact, they're in 2018, there were really no better or no worse than in previous years, although in 2017 they were a little low. In general, the long-term trend is catch rates tend to be pretty similar there. And that, of course, is only for the 12-inch season. We don't have during the spring, possession is not allowed, so we don't have those data for Deep Creek Lake. So I was talking to Steve, at the subcommittee meeting and the rest of the members about weigh-in mortality, and how I think there was this combination of angler action and habitat that are actually helping to benefit the fisheries. And I'm using this as just a small part of the evidence of that, but there are other things that I've seen out there. Better handling, weigh-in facilities that are more improved, and I think that there are just a lot of things going on here that are helping to benefit the fishery. Now, these data are basically the number of dead fish reported at the weigh-in scale. And I get that the percentage is really low, right? This is about 8% fish dead, 6%. So we're not talking about a lot of fish dead at scale. So that's not too surprising. Usually at scale, there aren't that many dead fish, and that's great. But we can still see a trend in the percentages, even though that percentage is low. And, in the late 2000s, early 2010s, that value is on average a little higher than it is now. We've seen kind of that decline in the percentage of dead fish at scale, which I think is a really good thing. And these data are for the Potomac River, but we've also seen that in the Upper Bay. These data are for the Upper Chesapeake Bay, and this is average number of dead fish at scale. We saw this uptick into the early 2010s, but then a sharp kind of decline where in 2013 we see very few fish dead at the scale. That average percentage was starting to increase, but then around 2016 we've seen this steady decline there. Again, we're talking about a really small percentage, so it's not a lot of fish, but it's interesting, I think, to kind of see this trend in the percentage of fish at scale. And I think the good news here is that there's good evidence here, I think, or decent evidence here that more fish are at least living here than had been during tournaments in the late 2000s. So I think that's good. Deep Creek Lake, again, we have few tournaments out there, but the trend's not, I think, that useful because we don't have that many actually reporting, but there is kind of a slight increase, but again, below 2%. So that's good in general. The other group of data that we use to kind of assess fisheries comes from our boat electrofishing, and our boat electrofishing data tend to indicate that we've got some pretty good fisheries, some pretty good populations right now in the Upper Bay and the Potomac River. We've got good reproduction, and we've got a good number of adults out there relative to our reference points. And I just kind of put together this really summarized report card because it's easier for me to understand when I just see a single value associated with the fishery here. And the point is that for the Upper Bay, the Potomac, and the Patuxent, we're in pretty good shape. There's some other systems, other fisheries, though, particularly on the eastern shore, that are not. Marshy Hope Creek and Nanticoke River are struggling. Those data come from us, but my counterpart at DNREC, Delaware Natural Resources and Environmental Control Agency, has seen the same thing. Their numbers of bass from the Nanticoke side, from the Delaware side of the Nanticoke, have declined as well. So something's going on with this system, but we're not sure exactly what just yet. The systems near Baltimore, Middle River, and Gunpowder, they seem to be doing a little bit better than they had been. That could be owed to some stocking events as well as better fish handling. But the those systems tend to be improving a little bit, but we have a very short time series for those systems, so it's hard to really say a whole lot just yet about them. Now, I gave that report card, but we do have a much longer narrative for each of those rivers, and I just wanted to kind of provide that for you guys. You should all have the PDF, so you can kind of review where those grades came from. And let me know if you have any questions specifically about those fisheries. But right now, the Upper Bay and the Potomac River, which are highly targeted by tournament anglers, seem to be doing really well. The other fisheries like Deep Creek Lake, I don't routinely manage, but I try and stay aware of because we do have black bass tournaments out there, and I'm affiliated with the permitting system there. I asked the regional managers for those fisheries for some data, for some information, and I pulled together this table of basically catch rates. This is just catch per electrofishing hour of bass, along with relative weights. What we're shooting for here is a value of about 100%. 100% would indicate a pretty normal fatty size bass. And the PSD percentage here is really just the proportion of larger size fish in the population relative to about an 8-inch fish, relative to a stock size fish. What we're really looking for here are values between 40 and 60% in a population. For the purpose of this, there's a lot of information here, but I really tend to focus on catch rates and relative weights because I find that those are two of the most useful factors here when kind of assessing a fishery. And the catch rates for Deep Creek Lake tend to be a little low relative to some of our other non-tidal systems, like St. Mary's Lake or Johnson's Pond on the eastern shore. It's a really small area. It's not often fished by tournament anglers, but does get some recreational pressure. Conowingo Reservoir has pretty good catch rates relative to Deep Creek Lake. I'm not really sure if there's a problem with Deep Creek or not because I'm not the regional manager out there. But I do know that those catch rates seem to be a little smaller from relative to Conowingo. The relative weights also tend to be a little low. As I said, we like to shoot for around 100%. So someone may look at that and say, well, maybe we're a little on the skinny side for those fish. But this is, I wanted to provide, I can't really say a whole lot about this. I did want to provide these data. So if you do have questions about those fisheries, if you get questions from your anglers, I can definitely put you in touch with the people who manage those fisheries. There are some other things that you guys may be interested in and hearing more about down the road. We were asked by the subcommittee to have a better joint management of the Potomac River fishery. So we reached parts in Virginia and District of Columbia to try and bring them to the table and figure out a way that we can better jointly monitor the fishery, or at least the population size of bass on the Potomac, to create a tagging project. And so the 3 jurisdictions, Virginia, Maryland, and Virginia, in DC, will begin tagging bass in the fall and hopefully get anglers to report recaptures. And with that information, we'll be able to estimate a population size. And the idea here is to generate that population size and kind of track it over time, and then create a joint assessment report among the jurisdictions so we can kind of evaluate jointly whether the fishery is in good shape or not in good shape, instead of doing what we're doing now, and that is each having our own individual assessments that may or may not be saying the same thing about the fishery. We have some other things going on in Virginia. I've reached out to Roger Trageser, who's the president for Maryland Bass Nation, and he came with me over to Leesylvania State Park, where we met my counterpart from Department of Game and Inland Fish and the park manager for Leesylvania. We'd like to try and get a weigh-in station at Leesylvania. It'll be another access point for tournament anglers and help provide them some infrastructure for having some tournaments there, so they don't have to bring in their own cattle tanks. But we are running into some issues there. Virginia has kind of a different system than Maryland does, and they have to get these plans approved through an independent engineering group, and there is some red tape there. So this is just something that we're going to have to maybe continue to talk about with Virginia, and I'm just being hopeful that we'll get that done, but I'm not so sure that that's going to happen. At Rogues Harbor on Elk River, we talked last year about having kind of a breakwater system and kind of a safe harbor for bass boats, so that when they roll up to have a tournament, they don't have to worry about a wake spilling them out of the boat. Right now, I just confirmed with our engineering people that the design has gone out to an engineer, one of their engineers, so they're basically looking at the plans that they have to ensure that they're going to work. My understanding is they do have funding for this project. They just need to get those design plans approved, and that's where we are with that project. We're in that approval period. And then I met with Steve and Stan at Glen Cove to talk about, and Herb Weichman, to talk about having kind of a weighing station at Glen Cove and Conowingo Reservoir. We'd like to try and get some infrastructure there for tournament organizers. And there's a lot of good, a lot of good reception to that idea there. And luckily, Joe Booker has kind of stepped up to the plate to have a tournament there in May, and that will allow us to offer some funding support to create this infrastructure at Glen Cove through our Black Bass Conservation Award. I don't know if you guys fish Conowingo often, but one of the concerns that I keep hearing about is the stacking up of wood in the Glen Cove area and the inability of bass boats to launch from that system. So I talked with our boating services folks, and I do have a contact over there. So if wood continues to stack up over there, we can call I can call hydrographics and have them come out and remove that wood. They do. The manager there at Glen Cove was putting out some infrastructure to try and prevent the wood from blocking up that boat launch area. Maybe that'll work. But if there does happen to be a problem down the road, I can reach out to our hydrographics unit and have them come out through boating services and have them come out and remove that wood. If you guys fish Deep Creek Lake or other public-owned non-tidal waters, you may be aware that there's a fine for boaters who launch their boat in public-owned waters of Maryland if their boats are contaminated with an invasive species like zebra mussel or hydrilla, or if there's mud and debris on the boat or the trailer. So what they're doing out in Deep Creek Lake and in Lake Habib is they're asking, or rather requiring, the boaters to fill out this self-certification form. It is a voluntary self-certification form, but basically what it does is it asks boaters just to kind of pay attention to key areas when they're launching their boat to make sure it is free of debris. And it's a checklist. And once they do that, they sign off on the form, and then hand the form over to park staff, and then they launch their boat. There's no fee for it. It's all voluntary. It's all a self-certification process. But as part of that, the boater was originally putting their name and their personal information on the form, but some folks didn't want to do that. So, I talked with the park staff, and they were able to exclude a lot of that personal information from the forms. And so now those forms have been updated and no longer require that personal information. So that's been updated, and that's available online through our website, through Tidal Bass Program's website, as well as through the park's website. And just an FYI, come May, we're going to begin, if you guys are interested in helping out, we're going to begin asking some of the directors to assist with a survey, an economic survey. We knew from last year, we did an angler intercept survey in the Upper Bay of the Potomac, and we estimated that bass anglers, black bass anglers, were spending over $38 million just fishing for black bass. And we have another economic survey for non-tidal waters that estimated over $400 million was spent in 2015 on recreational fishing in general. But we know that these are some pretty big numbers, but unfortunately, we don't really have great numbers for tournaments. We know that they're economically important, and counties say, tell us they're economically important, but the problem is we just don't have numbers to provide to that, except for a few studies, paid for by FLW and larger organizations. So what we're going to do is try and get a little bit more information on how much economic revenue is being provided by black bass tournaments. And I think that's important, because when Office of Tourism comes to us and they want to promote tournaments, or I go to the governor, I go to our secretary, and I say how important bass tournaments are, I can do that, and I can do that with a value figure that comes from smaller tournaments, as well as, say, the FLW or BASS. So come May, we've created a small, fairly quick survey of about 30 questions, and I'll probably reach out to some directors who are interested in kind of sharing that with their anglers. And if we can get that information from you guys, then I'll be able to create, analyze the data and generate a report for you guys, as well as for our director and secretary, just to kind of highlight the economic value. And I'd supply that information also with the Office of Tourism in the State House in an effort to try and promote black bass fishing through, competitive sport fishing within the state. And with that, I'll just point to a couple of regulations. There's nothing on the regulation front that is, really irking, I don't think. We've suggested to remove a fish refuge from Gumtree Cove on the Potomac because it's not acting as a black bass sanctuary. And we surveyed it for 3 years and during the spawning season, and never found a single black bass. So we've asked to remove that as a fish refuge. We're also trimming our snakehead regulation, which a lot of black bass anglers kind of want to stay in touch with what's going on with snakehead. So I threw that on here. We're trimming that regulation. Right now, anglers are required to kill them if they want to possess them. If they want to harvest them, they're required to kill them in one of 3 ways. But the regulation will likely be trimmed just to kill the snakehead if they want to possess it. But we're not going to require you to use one of those 3 methods. And then the other regulation for boaters, if you guys buy a boat decal in the state of Maryland, the regulation, there's usually a time delay between when you purchase it and when you actually get that boat decal. Well, the regulation that's being proposed would allow you to use a proof of purchase in that interim to prove to Natural Resource Police that you have a boat decal. So that's kind of a minor fix, but I thought it might be worthwhile to mention. And I know last year we talked about kind of extending the requirement to small tournaments to seek a permit, and those tournaments only get 10 boats. Right now it's going to be a little bit more work for us to do that, but I think it would be worthwhile So I guess over the next year, what we're likely to do is kind of get more feedback from tournament organizations on whether or not that would be a welcome change to the permit requirement. So that's all I have to say.
And the point there with that small tournament permit is that those of us who have to go through the permitting process encountered like a lot of the best practices information. We watched the videos and so on that are part of the permit process, but there are a lot of tournaments that fish the upper bay, but that don't encounter that information, the best practices information and so on. So I think my understanding was that we were asking to consider for the small tournament permit so that everybody encounters that information about practices. It's not really, to like control people or something. It's just a way to get the word out about how to conduct tournaments.
Right. Yep. So it's about those like sharing lines of information and communication. There are people out there conducting tournaments. They may have questions, but not know who I am or not know that we even have this program. So it'd be nice to, I think, try and establish those lines. But that's all I have to say. Thank you guys for listening. Steve, did you want to talk a little bit about the subcommittee?
Yeah, so the subcommittee was established a few years ago to help DNR because at the time there was sort of consideration of the permit, requirements, including these additional best practices having to do with fish care and with the way the fish are released or distributed after tournaments. And there was a lot of sort of feedback from the angling community, but it was felt that the Black Bass Advisory Subcommittee would be a good way, in an organized way, to consider the issues. And so initially we considered a lot of stuff around those permit requirements and whether those should become sort of statewide regulations. We opted against those. We've considered other issues such as stockpiling. What's mentioned here is the catch and release, the immediate catch and release for spawning areas are off limits. No additional regulations or permit requirements have come out of that process. The committee hasn't yet found sufficient evidence that there are issues that could be addressed effectively by the department through any additional regulation on the angling, but those are things that we are thinking about, and we're certainly interested in hearing any input from tournament directors or others about things that we should be considering that would help improve the management of the fishery. So we've turned our attention significantly to education issues, but also, as the first bullet says, to paying attention to habitat. We've got a sort of liaison set up to work with the department around habitat. The department is also going to be using the water reporter. Is that mentioned on here? So there's a new app out that the community at large can use to report on a spur of the moment, take a picture and just submit it. That helps everybody sort of alert the department and others to issues that are happening out there in the water. So that, Joe, that's coming up, that official sort of release. You're going to do a year trial period.
Yeah, we're in a trial period now. You can certainly download the app for free and join the water reporter group. It's all free, and it's, as Steve, as you said, it's literally as simple as if you see a fish kill on the water, or you see a source of pollution you want to report, and you're on your boat or something. It's literally as simple as pulling out your phone, opening the app, taking a picture, and then marking the location. Usually your phone, unless you turned it off, has that GPS locator already turned on. And then you can write something like fish kill, do something, and then submit. And then I get a notification. My counterpart, Maryland Department of Environment, gets a notification, and the river keeper, our liaison with the subcommittee, Nick Kuttner, will get a notification. So it's kind of I think just another tool for reporting issues and increasing responsiveness, I think.
We've also met with the natural resources police and trying to sort of establish better relations and open communication between the angling community and the natural resources police. We've met with hall seiners because it's believed by some, if not many, that some of the hall seining is, adversely affecting the black bass fishery, whether it's hall seinings that disrupt spawning areas or hall seining that tears up SAV. And I think, Joe, you've got some studies that you're planning to do to see the impact of hall seining. Is that right, or you did them?
No, we're going to, and it's looking at really the influence of trailing a net over grasses and having a heavy prop scar through a grass bed. So really what we're doing is trying to examine how this boating and dragging a haul seine affects grasses. So we're not really looking at fish in this case. We're really looking at submerged grass because we know how important it is for reproduction and growth of young bass.
Yeah. So those are the most important or salient issues that we've been working on, but we're open to hearing other needs that we need to take up. Maybe this is a good time for people to talk about issues that come up at tournaments, at weigh-ins, or issues you see in the fishery. Anything you want to discuss or raise for us?
Well, I have a question about Joe, your contact for the wood removal at Glen Cove. What kind of response time are you talking about there, and how locked up in wood would it need to be to make that kind of call?
Oh, for Glen Cove? Well, I don't know what response time it would be, to be honest with you. I imagine it would depend on how busy our hydrographics unit is at the time. And, some seasons, particularly during the spring, are busier than others, and they have priorities. So it's hard for me to say what that response time would be. But the good news here is that there's a possibility that what that manager's doing for the Glen Cove, that this shield he's basically having put in there, will redirect the wood. So that will hopefully reduce the amount of wood that's clogging up that area. But if it becomes a problem, my guess is you could either call me to call hydrographics, or I could provide you their phone number directly to give them a call, which would kind of speed things up on that end. And I don't know how quickly they would get out there, but I would say that it's going to be on their radar. So, I doubt if you were like launching a tournament that morning, or I doubt that they'd be able to get it all cleared up like within 6 hours, but
sure. It can happen like that because our tournament they had last spring, there were people that had been practicing during the week and everything was fine. And when they showed up on Saturday morning, it was just locked up tight. And they actually had to move their launch to Peach Bottom. But,
is that right?
Yeah.
Well, it sucks because I don't think there's anything you can do like right away in that case. But
yeah, sure.
But maybe getting hydrographics out there to remove the wood would help you, for the next weekend.
Yeah, I think Joe, you were right that the prevention is finding a way to keep it. And he's got that boom system in the water that was working pretty well until the major flooding that ripped out all the stuff in Glen Cove. So I'm sure he's got it back in place, but there's not a lot you can do when you got that much water.
Yeah. Well, is the launch is the weigh-in at Peach Bottom? Is it effective? Is it preferable? Why is it people wouldn't launch there normally versus Glen?
You're more exposed up there, and it also has some drop-offs that make it a little tricky with the trailer and the boat. But
okay. But you'd still say, though, when we're talking about designing or building up a weighing station, that it would make more sense to have it at Glen Cove versus Peach Bottom?
Well, yeah, otherwise you'd have to build something like you're talking about for Elk Neck to provide more protection.
For the boats.
Yeah.
Did any of you other guys have any questions?
I have one. Am I unmuted?
Yep.
Okay. So we have a tournament permit for having a race August 10th. And it's going to be kind of our first summer tournament there.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of just looking for recommendations because we don't have a cattle tank or aerator. So our initial thought is, okay, we're going to just call boats by number, keep fish in live wells, and just do 2 at a time and then release them. Is there any other suggestions for that area?
Yeah. So if you don't, as you said, Havre de Grace doesn't really have a weigh-in area. The guys that I talk to sometimes drive their fish out away from the dock area, but I've talked to people who, they take their boat into the dock. They have that immediate. They don't remove the boat. They just take the fish out of the boat. They immediately weigh them, put them right back in the boat, and then the boat, moves on. But really, it kind of depends on the size of the tournament, like what you can do. How many people you're expecting?
I'd say no more than 18 boats. I mean, that's pushing it. I'd say probably 15.
Okay.
15,
yes.
and that's mostly boaters. There's not too many riders. So.
Okay. Well, it sounds to me like you've got you've got some good options there, especially being so small. You could do that, as you described, where the anglers, take their fish out, they weigh them and they put them back in the boat, and then they motor them away. I mean, you could do something like that easy enough with a smaller number of boats. So I guess that's kind of the approach I see groups like TBF using. If they don't do the major league fishing style, I've seen groups like TBF just kind of motor their fish away, and that seems to be effective for them.
Okay. I mean, one thing. I mean, since our scale is battery operated, I can set it down on the dock, have everybody stay in the water, one at a time, come up beside the dock, weigh their fish, and take them out.
Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. As long as the guys know to keep their live wells circulating.
Right.
I think that sounds like a good plan.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what I can do. I can just leave, just tell them to stay in the water and come up one at a time.
Yeah, and as Joe was sort of suggesting, what we've noticed is that the state of the fish in the live well is perhaps the biggest determinant of how well they're going to do in that process. So your guys, a lot of boaters are pretty casual about the state of their live wells and the quality of their aeration and so on, and they don't even run their pumps all the time in the hot weather and so on. So if you can get your tournament to have in August, they should have those aerators and recirculators running full time.
Okay.
And then make sure when they do the put the fish in water bags, that those water bags are really full. You know, guys tend to minimize it because it's so heavy. And given that you've got a lot of single boaters, if you can have some guys come out and get on boats to help, you know, each single boater with the process of getting the fish out and maneuvering with a bag that's got a lot of water on it, that'll also make a big difference.
Okay, good suggestions. My other, we brought up last year, like, this is like, it always seems to happen where, and obviously, a public ramp, you're going to have a lot of public. Like, and it always seems like when we come in, it is just, it's kind of a traffic jam. And that's my only concern about, especially at Havre de Grace. I mean, you have a really small, short dock and don't really have room to, you know, set up unless we somehow like set up signs saying, okay, there's a permitted tournament here. They're coming in at 3 o'clock just to let the public know, you know, we're going to be there for at least, you know, 20 minutes to a half an hour.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything that, I mean, I guess, see, I haven't heard of anyone doing that. When, you know, BASS was originally, last year, they were originally going to be launching out of Havre de Grace, actually. And I had thought that would be, you know, kind of a big traffic jam issue there. And it had me a little concerned, but, you know, luckily with only 18 boats, you know, it won't be terrible. I wonder if you could put up a sign, you know, would that be something we could talk with the county about or with Havre de Grace about? I mean, it's possible that they might be open to that idea. I'm sure they wouldn't want a traffic congestion either, you know, on the water. I mean, it's something we could talk with them about if you thought that would help.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I believe it would. I mean, and it's really just for that short period of time, just at least so, I mean, not to like, you know, turn away the general public or anything, but just to let them know they may have to wait a little bit because of, you know, boats coming in and out of the water.
That's
so
right.
They're not getting all upset and arguments happen. And
yeah, we see the similar thing at Rogues Harbor sometimes with traffic jams. And, you know, I understand it's a communal space, but I do think that having that information out there helps people plan their day better.
Right.
You know, yeah, so I'll look into that. Did you submit that permit request already?
Yes.
All right, I'll look at the details of that, and I'll contact Havre de Grace and see what we can do.
Okay.
You know, one other strategy is to get one of those good hand scales and just hop from boat to boat and weigh, you know, use mesh bags, put the fish in the mesh bags and just weigh the mesh bag on the boat.
Also a good idea. Okay, so now would there be, so what, I mean, if that's the case, then what could really happen is we don't actually meet in the actual docking area. We can actually meet out in the no wake area.
Right, that's part of the point, that it's sort of a hybrid or intermediate version of the MLF sort of model, right, where you're weighing the fish on the water.
Right.
You just all congregate.
And then you would still recommend then, like, at least the anglers boating their fish back out, you know, out of the boat traffic.
That's better anyway.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I like that idea. As long as everybody knows that we're using the same scale for each bag.
Yeah, you have to pass the scale. And, you know, ideally pass a person so everybody trusts the reading. But yeah.
Okay.
I'll contact Havre de Grace anyway. I think it wouldn't be a bad idea for them to somehow note at the site when there are going to be tournaments, just so folks are aware that these events are happening. So I'll contact them one way or the other.
Okay, I mean, that sounds good, because I mean, it usually, when we come in, 2, 3 o'clock, it's like everybody's coming in for the afternoon or coming out at the same time, and it's just, I think it would be good public knowledge.
Yeah. Good point.
All right, thank you.
No, thank you.
I just had another quick question. The Water Reporter app, is there a name for that app, or is that the name?
That's the name.
Okay, Water Reporter.
Where's it? You have a link to it from DNR?
What's that?
You have a link on your page?
The Water Reporter? No, I don't think we do have a link to that website, but I can put one.
Yeah.
I can put one there. That's not a problem. I believe I believe the website address is actually waterreporter.org. But I'll put it up on the website.
Thanks.
Great suggestion. Any other questions, comments?
Any concerns that you have about the way other people are running tournaments, or things that you see going on in the field that we should be paying attention to?
Okay, I got one more. We have a tournament at the Potomac out of Smallwood, I think. So I have never been there, but what others have, no, Marshall Hall. What others have told me, wind really dictates whether it's safe to go out of that location or not. And that's where we have a permit. So I'm kind of worried about, okay, if the day before wind picks up, like, can we just shift upstream to go out of another location? And we're talking about the same amount of boats. We're not talking about a big, huge tournament.
Yeah. So there's a couple of places. There's a marina out of Fort Washington. It's owned by the state, but it's leased to a private group. I don't think. I mean, it's an operational marina. I don't know what the fee is for launching there. I could find that out, but that actually launches straight into the Piscataway, which is a little bit more, it's not on the main stem like Marshall Hall is.
Right.
And then you have on the other end, on the Virginia side, you have the Dyke Marsh launch. But I had heard that was actually disappearing soon, so I don't know if it's still.
Yeah. And I think based on all our guys, we would want to stay on the Maryland side just because of licensing.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, then I think Fort Washington, if necessary, you could use that. But honestly, I think Marshall Hall's a better launch, so I just hope that you'd have some pretty good wind if you're going to be up that way.
Yeah, you're just more exposed. And we've always used Fort Washington or Smallwood.
Yeah, I think everybody, well, the guys that have been there have suggested Smallwood if it's not going to work out for Marshall Hall.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to. I was just kind of concerned about the permit. Like, is it going to be a big deal whether or not, if it's like a last minute decision?
For Smallwood?
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. They schedule things there, and unlike a lot of other venues, including state parks like Gunpowder.
Actually, is it Mattawanna or
Mattawoman?
Yeah. What about that location as a secondary, like, bad weather launch?
Yeah, so Smallwood State Park is on Mattawoman. It's near the mouth, but There's another launch if you wanted. So I'd say if you can't get a permit from Smallwood State Park to launch on Mattawoman, because they've got a triathlon scheduled or something,
Right.
then you could try looking at Slavin's Wharf, which is a upper part of Mattawoman. It's still tidal, so it's a smaller launch. It's still tidal, so it's fairly decent launch. You can launch out of that, and it would be fine for small boats.
Okay, because I think that's what they suggested when the weather's bad. I mean, they said about there's a long idle period to get out.
Yeah, that's true. There is.
But I just wanted to make sure, like, okay, if it's last minute decision, because we already have the permit for Marshall Hall, and that's why, like, there's a lot of guys that are coming, I don't know, 2.5 hour drive. I kind of need to know, is that another alternative just to go out upstream?
Yeah. Well, like Steve said, Fort Washington might work out, or you could always try Slavin's too.
Okay.
It's on Mattawoman. You can always try that.
Okay. That's good. That's all I need to know.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I know one question we got through email was about those of us who are using the mesh weigh bags system where the mesh bags are inserted in the water bags. And one of the things that's been a problem is getting a hold of mesh bags because the Duncan Just Keepers was a nice bag and they've gone out of business or they've stopped producing them. But we recently got hold of the Gator Grip bags and their mesh bags fit in the Duncan water bags. So they're a lot lighter. So you have to figure out, how to handle it if you've got a mixed set of weigh bags. Just tear every time you're doing your weigh. But they do work and they seem good quality.
Anyone else got any questions, thoughts?
Well, thanks a lot, everybody. It's been great to have the conversation.
Yeah, appreciate the get together. Stay in touch and have a good night.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thanks a lot, guys. See you later.
You take care.